Hi, I'm your host, Karim Rafa. Welcome to Coffee and Conversation. I'm joined today with Harry Chimay, co-founder and CEO of Clover. Harry, thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you, Karim. Thanks so much for having me.
Can you tell me more about what Clover does then? Because you're coming from an advisory background
Yes.
in consulting and FI.
Yes.
How does that plug into what Clover does, and how did you get there? What was that jump?
Really, well, I'm using all my skill sets and those of my co-founders who are all ex-Mercer themselves. And we're sort of bringing that institutional asset consulting mindset and skills, I guess, in portfolio construction, rebalancing, asset allocation to the average person in the street. So one of the things I'm passionate about is how does the average person now access advice, high quality advice, without the associated high costs and fees involved.
I know that in the US, pretty much everyone has a portfolio and they manage it themselves. Europe is pretty much the exact opposite. It's very much a state pension sort of scheme.
Yes.
What's the marketplace in Australia like?
Yes, a mix of both. A mix of both. It's very strange, but Australia is, well, first things first about Australia, not many people know this, but Australia is now the wealthiest country in the world. To be fair, Karim, that really is in two main asset classes. It's in physical assets, real estate, and it's in our pension system, which is called superannuation in Australia, which in totality, in aggregate, superannuation in Australia now is north of $2 trillion US.
Wow.
We were, I guess, a bit forward-thinking. Thankfully, we had some forward-thinking governments through the 80s and into the 90s that instituted that system. The problem, however, for Australians, and we see this with what we do, is there's sort of nothing in the middle. So it's a bit of a barbell in Australia where wealth is held either in bricks and mortar or in your retirement fund. And young Australians, especially millennials, who Clover services a lot of, they struggle with things like saving enough for a first home deposit.
I feel like this robo-advisory is a very popular space at the moment. I understand Charles Schwab has their own huge robo-advisor. I think it's the biggest one worldwide.
Yes.
And there are quite a few more. How do you differentiate yourselves?
Robo-advice will become what I call digitally enabled or digitally facilitated advice. So it's a tool. It's a tool to be used by planners, advisors, banks to reach out to more clients and service more clients. But every robo-advisor, let's continue with that phrase, will find their own niche. Some will pivot towards the very young, early people who just want to round up their coffees and their croissants in the morning. I get that. Others will pivot towards the more retirement end of the market, which is a big focus in Australia because like many advanced economies, we have a rapidly aging demographic. The silver tsunami, as it's coming to be known around the world.
Now, Australia hasn't really seen that much of a push because 2007 didn't affect you quite as hard as it did the rest of the world.
Yes.
How is that for Clover? How do you find yourselves in that space?
So we feel that if you want to provide a good service to the client and you want it to be something of value and lower the cost and increase transparency, ETFs are a great starting point. And let's face it, I truly do believe that ETFs or index funds are probably the last great financial invention. We can talk about ATMs and banks rolling them out, and over time people becoming comfortable with dealing with a machine, a hole in the wall for their banking needs. I think for investing, ETFs have done exactly that. They have removed a lot of the frictions and lowered costs precipitously, really, over the last sort of 10 to 20 years. And I think actually the GFC was that tipping point where a lot of pension funds, a lot of state funds realized that, hang on a sec, we're paying a lot of money here to active managers. How much are we actually really getting? And what is the probability of them beating the market consistently over a long period of time, especially after fees and taxes?
As you said, a robo-advisor reminds you a bit of a Terminator like droid coming back to kill the advisors, right? We've talked to some Swiss private banks who have no fear at all of losing their jobs. Where do you find yourself in? Do you think it's a shift in the overall paradigm? So it's going to be more of a right robo-advisors, left huge wealth, very wealth-oriented private bankers, or what's in between?
I look at it this way. I think it's an omni-channel approach. It is horses for courses. At the very high end of the market, you will always have private bankers, and they need not fear robo-advisors at all. Because at the very high end, you're dealing with family offices, you're dealing with high complexity, you're dealing with intergenerational wealth transfer. Personally, I believe that'll always be a human-to-human interaction. Well, once again, I do believe that robo-advisors ultimately will play a pivotal role in the middle and back office. I do believe the front interaction will predominantly be human to human, or human advisor assisted by some robo tools, and then the middle and back office being very highly technology driven.
We've talked about the superannuation system in Australia and the pension system and how it compares
Yes.
to the West.
Yes.
How do you see the defined benefit towards the defined contribution,
Yes.
and how does that fit into the global shift in pensions?
To give you an example, in Australia, before compulsory superannuation came in, the Australian landscape was defined by defined benefit schemes. And defined benefit schemes by nature is almost a promise by the employer that at the end of your working life, you will get some pot of money based on some formula. Since then, there's been a shift to defined contribution, which is basically just that. You define the contribution you put in. With Aussie employees, it's about 10% of their wage. It goes into a superannuation fund, and then it's really up to how the superannuation fund performs over time, and critically, how it performs in the last few years leading up to retirement and the first few years of retirement. So the key thing is that the risk sharing shifts to the employee, and it's a big quandary in Australia because that's something that we are now grappling with as the Australian population ages. How does the social sharing work in terms of how much does the government pick up in terms of pensions, age pensions, social security nets for the aged, versus how much is on the individual?
So coming back to Clover, how do you define your market? If you don't touch the superannuation
Yes.
and you don't touch the brick and mortar either,
Yep.
it would be everything that's excess cash, so to speak, or investable cash.
Very, very much so. So no surprises. The core of our Clover users in Australia are young millennials who are very tech savvy, who earn very high incomes, but still, as I said, have to save for multiple years, 5, 6, 7, maybe up to 8 years, just to break into the ridiculously expensive housing market in Australia. But by the same token, that's why we spun up the Clover for Advisors channel, because we have so many advisors that were coming to us saying, look, we want our clients to get access to lower cost online tools. And it's not only the clients, but the clients' children. They are online and solving their problems online. And these advisors recognize that without having these tools, they may actually lose the wealth that they're managing as the parents pass away and the money moves off to the next generation.
With process automation being huge in finance and banking, what would the Google of banks look like? So very tech savvy and with a huge increase in customer bases over time.
But what does banking look like in the future as that breaks down, that traditional intermediation model breaks down? Because there are so many fintechs around the world chipping away at bits and pieces of it, whether that is the deposit taking part or whether that's the lending part or what we do in the wealth management. So banks really are in an interesting space in that they have to redefine what they are. Do they go back to core? Do they try to compete with the likes of Alipay and Google Pay? What does a Google Bank look like? You mentioned that. And here's the thing, right? If you've got the eyeballs and if you've got the data, you can potentially monetize that as a financial institution. What is the role for a central bank in a system where there's a Google Bank which effectively operates globally, right? How do you control monetary policy and interest rates when there is a Google Bank?
And which country's monetary policy do you adhere to?
Exactly right, Karim. So these are all fundamental questions that central bankers and policymakers have to address.
If you think about legacy banks, be it JP Morgan or even HSBC, which is a bit newer, and their increase in users over time compared to Facebook's increase in
Yes.
users over time, it's not even comparable.
Yes, we talk about this, me and my co-founders, we talk about this all the time. It's the ability to scale, right? So this is where the paradigm has shifted. Banks were impressive in their ability to scale back in the day. Technology companies have just taken that and just made it exponentially greater.
Yeah, moving away from the brick and mortar has made it easier. You can engage with a technology company with your cell phone in your pocket. You don't have to go anywhere.
Exactly right, and I think the Chinese have done this the best, right? Obviously, they're working off a billion people as a potential just in-house market within their own country, but the ability to scale is phenomenal using technology and that network effect.
They also have this one app culture, right? And I think that really stems from the fact that they managed to share their data within one app or company or acquire a group of companies and share their data. The problem with banks was very much that they didn't make the most out of the data they had. technically Visa or MasterCard, which are just payment gateways, should know what your spending habits are, and based on that, they can technically sell you more specific things. Alipay seems to have very much monetized their data analytics tools.
Yes, I think you've nailed it. You've nailed it. They realized that data was the goal from day one. They had that gold, and they were smarter in how they could use it and monetize it. I think banks have only come to that realization more recently, and therefore they are in catch-up mode.
Harry, thank you so much for this. It was a great chat.
My absolute pleasure, Karim.
Thank you all for watching. This was Coffee and Conversation, and we'll see you soon.